Good evening again, and welcome. My name is Denise, the other Denise, Denise Tam, and I'm the representative of Pure Encapsulations here in Hong Kong. And we also want to welcome our other Pure family in the Philippines, Spectrum Innovations, and we partner with them to do a lot of these webinars and education for our practitioners. And before we start, I'd like to remind you to use the chat box on the side if you have any questions or comments, but we will have a time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So tonight's topic is on an evidence-based approach to menopause. Menopause, is a natural part of aging, yet it's hardly ever spoken about. But I've been very pleased to see actually in recent months, this has slowly been shifting even in the public sphere, in the public light. Hong Kong, just a few months back, we even had a public forum dedicated solely to menopause. And I think this is just a reminder to us that there are needs that need to be met. And this is why I actually made a special request to Denise to talk about this topic. And so we hope that through this webinar, we can also be better prepared as practitioners in helping our patients through this time of change. Now, on multiple conversations with Denise and also taking part in her biological age study, there really is no one better than Dr. Furness to speak about aging well and going through this natural phase of perimenopause and menopause. I'm sure many of you are now very familiar with Denise. You can check out her bio, but I think to save time, I will skip the formal introductions. She will have her bio at the end, and you can check out her page, her website. And I'll now pass the time over to Dr. Denise Furness.
Hello, thank you, Denise. Yes, it's the Denises back again. I am so glad that you asked me to present on this because I also agree that it's not talked about enough. My postdoctoral fellowship was in obstetrics gynecology, and obviously I've studied biology, physiology in my undergraduate years, and I remember learning so much about, reproductive biology, learning about development in the early years, puberty, remembering that, testosterone increases and the male or the teenage boy's shoulders will, expand, all these little things you remember. But what I learned about menopause was that it happens at around about the age 50, women stop getting their period, and there really wasn't a lot of information. And I find that most patients coming to me really have no idea what is going on or what to expect. And I am happy, like Denise, that it is being talked about a lot more now. I've just come back from IFM over in Las Vegas, so the Institute of Functional Medicine, and menopause was a hot topic. And actually, I'd already submitted these slides, and I was very happy to see that the things I'm going to be talking to you about tonight, particularly a lot with the exercise too. I'll touch on it briefly, but if you've got more questions, and perhaps as I'm going through, I might mention some of the things that were talked about at IFM, but it really did validate everything that is covered in this talk. And I'm also myself personally starting to experience this. So I'm 45, turning 46 in September. And little things that perhaps some of you here know because you've gone through menopause or worked with lots of patients. I didn't even realize that your cycle gets shorter. And I thought, what's going on? Shouldn't my periods be slowing down and they're coming, they should be less? But no, they're getting shorter and heavier. And I've never had menstrual issues or issues with my cycle. I've been very lucky. And I now know that this is common, but people don't talk about that and say, well, it's likely that you'll get shorter cycles and go from whatever it is, 28 to 26 days. Your period will get heavier. You think, wow, that's the exact opposite of what I was expecting. So I'm just going to touch really briefly on perimenopause and menopause. I think most of you understand these hormonal changes, the focus is really going to be on the diet, lifestyle, and supplement interventions and how I integrate this in practice. So I can't help but talk about aging. As Denise has told you, last year I ran the Healthy Aging Study, which is really around trying to reverse biological age or slow the aging process. And of course, we don't want to be, we're not scared of death. We're not trying to avoid getting old. In our later years, we have more wisdom. These can be exciting times full of joy and hopefully vitality. But the reality is, most people in at least their last decade or perhaps even 2 decades, because in places like the UK, they actually have a health gap of about 22 years. Women in the UK live their last, on average, 22 years with a chronic illness, a chronic disease, or a disability. 22 years. Imagine, it's just such a long time. In Australia, that's about 10 years. And I'm trying to remember the talk that I gave for Hong Kong, Philippines last time. I think it was about a 10-year health gap for you in Southeast Asia as well. But we want to try to shorten that gap. I mean, tonight the focus is on this transition through menopause, but really it is about healthy aging for women, feeling good, being at our best, and not letting certain things, cause us, pain, fatigue, and affecting our quality of life. But the whole purpose of this slide is really just to say that, and perhaps this is why, back 20, 30 years ago, particularly in my undergraduate, early days going through, learning about biology, we didn't hear much about menopause. Probably the textbooks are mainly written by men a really long time ago. And if you look back, 100 years ago, only 100 years ago, which is not that long ago, you can see that if we are to look at, say, the world, if you can see my mouse here, the world, so the average, this dark green line, the average age for life expectancy, so lifespan, not health span, which is the healthy, but lifespan, was, around 40 years. So at that time, women weren't really going through menopause back then. And even if we just go back, say, 50 years, the 1970s, we can see that life expectancy is, if we're looking here again at world data, or Asia is very close to that, it's about 60 years. So less years living in this phase where we have lower hormones. Whereas now, when we're getting into 2024, it's actually increased a little. We can see that the average life expectancy is, over 70 years. There's a little dip here. We know that a lot of countries had a bit of a dip during COVID, but it's going back up. And this life expectancy is predicted to keep going up. Now, slowly, but it's keep going up and up and up. In a decade or so, a few decades, we're going to be having an average life expectancy into our 90s. Now, that doesn't mean that we're into our 90s and we're living a healthy life. Some people will be dependent on many medications, whether they're in a nursing home. But we can do a lot. We can make choices. We have a lot of control over our health to ensure that we have more years living in this sort of healthier state and less in that chronic illness and disease. But fascinating that only 100 years ago, women weren't going through menopause because we weren't just living to that age. So it's a relatively new thing for us to experience. So when it comes to menopause, we know that as we age, particularly post 40, for some even in their late 30s, our estrogen levels go down. Of course, also progesterone. This is linked with a number of common symptoms that we think about, particularly affecting our sleep, our mood, possibly our weight. And then when we think about post-menopause, there are a lot of conditions that are associated with this: osteoporosis, heart disease, cancers, depression. But the reality is these things do not have to occur. If we do the right things in our younger years, what we're going to be talking about to help with the transition, it's not just about helping with that transition and dealing with those symptoms, the things that we talk about from a diet, lifestyle, exercise, and supplement perspective actually also help prevent osteoporosis, prevent cardiovascular disease, prevent, Alzheimer's and dementia. So when we think about menopause, often the focus is on estrogen and progesterone. But if we're thinking about managing the symptoms, then we also need to put a big focus on things like cortisol and insulin. A lot of these mood issues or sleep issues might be due to adrenal things and cortisol. Often there may be blood sugar imbalance. Women may be eating, later at night, more so carbohydrates. We know that in perimenopause and menopause, women become more insulin resistant. So we're not as good at sort of pulling that glucose out of the blood. And there are many reasons for that, but one of them, which we'll get into, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but is to do with sarcopenia, or just losing our muscle mass as well, because the more muscle you have, you're pulling the glucose out of the blood into the muscle, making glycogen. The reality is, as we age, we tend to be more and more inactive. And I do have a lot of women say to me, oh, it's menopause. I can't lose weight. It's menopause. But our lifestyle changes significantly. And one thing I'm going to talk about, I won't spend too much time, but is exercise. And I have to say that was a huge focus at IFM. And if people do want to know more about exercise, the speaker that I was most impressed with over there, she's an exercise physiologist, I believe, was Stacey Sims. Mind you, we don't all have to look like her. I think she's in her 50s and had big muscles everywhere. And she was pretty intense about how much exercise you have to do. Believe me, I'm not here to say as much as she had a very strict regime. But the reality is we can't get away with not moving. In addition to thinking about cortisol and insulin, if you can balance these, it's actually going to improve a lot of those symptoms that we have during perimenopause. Thinking about our lipids, and then this together can help with energy, weight, and overall metabolic health. So when it comes to our diet, we want to think about time-restricted eating. And in all honesty, it's not really time-restricted eating. It's just about having a bit of a pause, not eating late into the evening. Generally, I think about I recommend for women, this is not men, a 14-hour fast and a 10-hour eating window. So this can help with improving digestion, glucose regulation, thinking about the blood sugars and insulin, and can help with weight loss as well. So a lot of people think about the 16-8. Those studies were done in men and mainly male athletes, not in women. And sometimes people ask me about extended fasting. There are, lots of sort of, I guess, buzzwords right now with all the biohackers too in the healthy aging space, thinking about autophagy and doing longer fasts. The reality is with these longer fasts is you lose a lot of your lean tissue, that muscle mass. And as we age, it can be very difficult to put that back on. So the long-term consequences of longer fasts actually may outweigh the benefits. So you definitely don't want to overeat, but you want to be getting in plenty of nutrients, plenty of vitamins, plenty of minerals, and definitely plenty of protein. And that was a big thing that was talked about at IFM. And Denise has done my study. She actually saw what my protocol was. And actually, I think I shared the protocol with you all last year. And if not, you can go back to that webinar on healthy aging. And we had a relatively high protein intake for that. But I'll get into amounts of protein in the coming slides. But as I said, overall, of course, we tweak this. We do personalized medicine, functional medicine. But as a general rule, I think 14 hours and a 10-hour window, it's not difficult. You're not stressing the body, particularly if someone is having adrenal issues. It's not putting them under too much stress. People aren't going to get these ups and downs, the mood issues, and there's a nice gap there to help with digestion and things like that. Now, if women do want to experiment with different types of fasting, maybe a 5-2 or an extended fast, of course, I'm not going to stop them. But the main thing I would say is ensuring that they are not malnourished. Do they have enough protein? Are they, adequate with whatever it may be, folate, B vitamins, zinc, things like that. Because if you do these fasts and there is some deficiencies, again, you're not going to get those benefits. And if anything, people are then going to start to have a lot of cravings. Often when people are fasting for longer periods, they don't sleep well. That then comes with other negative things as well. So when it comes to our fats, menopause has been associated with altered circulating lipids. So changes to our lipoproteins, our cholesterol, triglycerides, and really this comes down to often that excess adipose tissue. So more fat, particularly that visceral fat, and that comes with pro-inflammatory cytokines and more oxidative stress. And studies have shown that the adipose tissue of postmenopausal and premenopausal women is actually different. And this lipid peroxidation, so basically these oxidized lipids, these inflammatory cytokines that are released from this fat tissue, increase the risk for insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, and really overall, inflammation that's going to affect how that woman's going to feel. So it's really important that we think about the quality and the type of fats, particularly in this phase where we can be a bit more sensitive to fats. And if anyone's done genetics, obviously we're not talking about genetics today, but if you have done DNA testing, some of you might actually have ApoE4 alleles, which mean that you are likely to have higher LDL, or other genes that mean you don't use fat for energy as much, or you're predisposed to high cholesterol. So that's something else to consider. But regardless of genetics, during this phase of life and as we're aging, we really do want to think about getting in as many of the omega-3s, our polyunsaturated fats, even some of the monounsaturated fats, and reducing our overall omega-6s. Now, obviously, I will talk about evening primrose oil, which does have a component in it which has been shown to be really helpful for some of the symptoms with menopause. And when I'm talking about omega-6s, I'm really talking a lot about these kind of, the seed oils, things that are found in processed foods, and things like that. Now, I've got to consider testing. I really do love testing. You can look at the ratio of omega-3s and 6s. I did mine last year. Actually, I was at a conference and someone said to me, did I want to do it? I used to do a lot of this testing. I'm not sure if you do that over in Hong Kong and the Philippines. I'm probably guessing you do. It's a relatively easy test. Here we can just do it via blood spot. But I hadn't done mine in a while. I'd actually stopped doing them, and mine was, yes, not nearly as good as I had hoped, and definitely got back onto my omega-3s. And the reality is I don't eat a lot of oily fish. I might eat salmon once a week, and that's not even every week, maybe 3 times a month. And that's just because, I think about the pollutants that are in the fish from the oceans. I mean, I'd much prefer to be getting my omega-3s from foods, and the best source is sort of oily fish. Of course, we can get some from seeds and plant sources, but it's harder for the body to convert that into that DHA and EPA. It has to go through another number of enzyme reactions. But we just need to be really cautious if we are eating a lot of seafood, that is seafood that's hopefully not contaminated with too many chemicals and toxins, as we all know in this sort of functional medicine space. So protein. I was really happy at IFM to see that everyone was on the same page as me, because when we do think about healthy aging and the blue zones, so often we hear about these blue zones, people living longer, and it tends to be around a plant-based diet. And I think actually having plenty of plants is really, really important. My healthy aging protocol actually suggested 6 serves of veggies a day, which really isn't that much when you think half a cup of cooked vegetables is a serve. But we want to be getting that protein in, and it doesn't always have to be from animal sources, whether it's from plant sources as well. There are plenty of plant sources, particularly thinking about some of the phytoestrogens like soy, tofu, tempeh, things like that. Even hemp seeds have got quite a good amount of protein in there. but getting enough protein to ensure that we're not losing that muscle, because that muscle is what keeps your metabolism going. It helps you with regulating your blood sugars. You actually feel better and stronger, and your ability, particularly as you age, to, whether it be, pick up a grandchild, travel, whatever, we want to have that muscle mass. But definitely during menopause or perimenopause, as I'll discuss, by maintaining our muscle or even adding muscle, can actually compensate for some of the losses in estrogen. So low dietary protein might also limit weight loss, resulting in this sarcopenia. And this can easily be adjusted with diet and exercise. So it doesn't matter what age, you can build muscle. So it's never too late to start exercising. It's never too late to start considering your protein intake. But the older we get, it just takes a little bit longer. So there are studies suggesting that 30 to 45 grams of protein with breakfast and lunch may be associated with better lean mass, particularly in older people. And interestingly, here in Australia, I didn't check your recommended dietary guidelines. I usually do before I do talks, but I'm not getting into the RDIs here. But here in Australia, our protein recommendations for older men actually increases. But interestingly, for women, it doesn't. And the reality is women also experience sarcopenia, actually to a greater level than men, and at an earlier stage during perimenopause. So we lose muscle mass earlier and generally faster than men. I wouldn't be surprised now that there is this movement around talking about menopause and trying to optimize health during perimenopause in these later years, that we will start to see that the recommended dietary intakes for protein for women will increase with age. It's definitely there for men, but not for women as yet. So this is a lot of protein. I generally say about 30 grams. I think getting 45 would be difficult, but studies suggest this can be helpful. You don't want to have too much protein if you're not doing strength training. The reality is it's just hard work for the kidneys. It's still going to be excess calories. So thinking about it, obviously, with your patient's activity levels as well. Intervention trials, and I definitely saw this last year with my healthy aging study. So I've seen this personally, plus you've got a couple of references down there showing that interventions that do have a higher protein intake show that people lose more fat, but not their muscle. Because the biggest issue with weight loss in our later years, particularly if people start doing fasting or a low calorie diet, and they're not eating enough protein, is they actually lose muscle. So their metabolic rate goes down, and then they might bounce back and put on weight, but they're just putting on fat, and then they don't have that muscle either. And it's even harder for them to get that adipose, that fat tissue off. We want to keep that metabolic rate going. We want to have, your muscle has all the mitochondria making the ATP, giving you the energy. So we definitely don't want to lose that muscle. So we need to be cautious when we're thinking about weight loss and ensure that we are promoting fat loss and not muscle loss. Now, I think this is a pretty low amount. I think this is relatively easy to get. And this would be a minimum, saying 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo. Now, this is a little bit higher. In Australia, our recommended dietary intake for women, I think, is about 0.7. So this is slightly higher than sort of government guidelines here. But this is taken from a study in relation to, menopause and lean tissue, and saying that this amount of protein may compensate for some loss of muscle mass during weight loss. And they suggest higher if they're doing strength training. So in my healthy aging study, I actually recommended 1.5 to 2 grams of protein per kilo. So if someone was 60 kilos, we're looking at, 90 to 120 grams. And that's because we did actually, we had an app. Denise joined a little bit later, not at the beginning when the app was running. It was actually, we had an exercise physiologist as part of the study. And in that app, we actually were giving guidance around exercise. Strength training was a minimum of 3 times a week, plus movement snacks during the day. We did have a big emphasis on exercise in the study as well. Now that we've finished that healthy aging study and people are more looking for long-term dietary information, sort of not such an intense intervention, and not all of them are able to maintain that level of exercise. I did say to most people, 1.5 is more than enough, because again, I think having 2 grams, if you're not doing strength training, you're not going to be utilizing that for growing muscle. So the other thing to think about is not just muscle loss, but is also bone loss. And, I don't think sarcopenia is talked about in women enough. It tends to be talked about a lot in men, but as I said, it happens earlier in women during perimenopause. But as we're losing muscle, we're also losing bone. So these are the other things to think about too when we are considering weight loss. Are we getting enough minerals in, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and things like that? We don't want to be losing our minerals, because not only are we losing our muscle, we're starting to lose our bone. And again, we want to think about the long-term health outcomes. So often I'm asked, particularly because women may get a bit more sensitive to carbohydrates, not regulating their blood sugars so well, they're putting on weight. Should they cut carbohydrates? And the answer is sort of yes and no. And not in the sense of all carbohydrates, but really getting rid of the added sugars and reducing refined carbohydrates. Now, really, this should be across the board for everyone. But as we age, it is more important to do this. Now, if you are like this lady I mentioned, Stacey Sims, who at IFM, or like my old trainer, in her 50s, and you've got huge biceps and you've got abs, which is really hardly any 50-year-old women I know, then you can afford to eat a lot more carbohydrates. You've still got that muscle that's going to be pulling in that glucose. But if your body composition has changed, you're quite soft, you don't have that muscle, you really need to think about limiting your carbohydrates. In saying that, though, it's not about avoiding, vegetables and fruits and even some whole grains if you can tolerate them. It's just about getting rid of those, refined carbs. And if you are thinking about, rice, which is really common in Asian countries, but even here in Australia, everywhere really, the trick of cooking and then cooling our starches, because that then changes that chemical composition. You've got more resistant starch, and that resistant starch actually isn't absorbed. Humans can't absorb that. It actually just goes on to feed the microbes in our gut, and then we tend to get more short chain fatty acids like butyrate and things like that. So this is a good little trick. Cook it, cool it, have a small portion, so you're still getting some of that fiber, which is really good for the gut, moving everything through, feeding the gut bacteria. But it's kind of like a trick in the sense that you're not actually absorbing as much of it, but still very, very good for you. So phytoestrogens during perimenopause, and I have to say I've actually, moved to bonsai, soy milk as well. This is a good thing, and this is talking about postmenopausal health, suggesting that there seems to be a reduction in vasomotor symptoms with menopause and phytoestrogen intake, although it's likely small and a slow onset. This is different to obviously taking estrogen. A lot of these phytoestrogens are really weak estrogen sort of mimickers or binding weakly to our receptors. But there is some suggestion that it can even help with improving bone mineral density and markers of cardiovascular risk. We obviously need a lot more long-term and bigger studies, but there also appears to be no harmful effects, because once upon a time there were concerns around phytoestrogens with cancers, breast cancer, endometrial cancer, but it doesn't look like that anymore. So more recent evidence suggests it's likely to be quite protective. If we are thinking about something like breast cancer, and if you do the Dutch test, we're looking for those estrogen metabolites, like the 4-hydroxy, the 16. So the 4-hydroxy in particular is the most reactive estrogen pushing down that pathway. If it's not cleared by methylation or glucuronidation, sulfation, it can then cause, DNA damage. They become estrogen quinones that are very reactive. They're the estrogens linked with breast cancer. These phytoestrogens in foods aren't really increasing these sort of high estrogen quinones. And as I said, they're quite weak in the aspect of, our estrogens. The other thing to be, which I don't have in here, and something that I do talk about with women, we talked about in the healthy aging study when we're talking about things that mimic estrogen, is we definitely want to be avoiding those xenoestrogens. So avoiding all the xenoestrogens, but putting in some of these good, healthy phytoestrogens in this transition time when estrogen's dropping, and then coming in with more of these phytoestrogen foods can be really helpful for a lot of women. And some women actually notice it. They do feel better. Some, it doesn't really cut it. They need a lot more support than just adding in some phytoestrogen foods. So when it comes to diet, I prescribe a 4-week whole food challenge. This is something I've been doing for a while, and I don't just do this for women who are perimenopausal. I do this for all of my clients, but it's something that can be really helpful in the sense that, straight away we're getting rid of sugar, so the refined carbs, but then we actually start to explore if there are any sensitivities around dairy and gluten. And this can be a real game changer for people. Sometimes, removing gluten, they'll go back on it, when the whole food challenge is finished, and they'll realize they were actually getting brain fog or they were getting a bit of joint pain. So the dietary aspect can be really significant for a number of people. So as I mentioned, I do reintroduce these to assess symptoms, because I want people to actually eat as much food as they can in the sense of diversity and nutrients. I'm not about having an elimination diet long term, or eliminating foods if it's not actually harmful for the person. But for some people, we know these foods aren't good. And actually, I've got one patient right now who eliminated dairy, and I've never had this before. I don't know if any of you have had this, but she's lost 6 kilos. She was doing the healthy aging study, and she was doing really well, but she's actually vegetarian. So we've had to work a lot at trying to sort of keep her protein up. Vegetarian, and then obviously got rid of the dairy as well at the beginning of the study. So she's become vegetarian because her cholesterol is quite high and she didn't really enjoy meat anyway. That was her choice, not me. But yeah, she's gotten rid of dairy. That was sort of the next step, and has lost 6 kilos. It's just like, wow. So there was something in that was obviously triggering her gut, causing inflammation. So this is definitely the start of the process. And for some people, it can be a game changer. Others, we obviously need to do a little bit more than diet. It's definitely the foundation. So when we're thinking about lifestyle, I have mentioned, if we look over here on the left, I've already mentioned how important during, and this says menopause, but, really perimenopause, really in the late 30s, we stop, our bone stops, building in our 30s. We actually start getting a reduction in our bone density in our 30s, which I was really shocked to first learn. Again, I don't remember ever being taught that. I don't know if we even knew that back when I was sort of doing all my studies. But in our 30s is really where we've laid down most of our bone. So it's really important that from then onwards, we are doing this resistance strength training to increase or at least maintain that bone density. Now, I will just say, we're told that after our 30s, we're generally not increasing our bone mass. But I have had one patient, she was in her 70s. Actually, she had Alzheimer's. I was working with her daughter. We had phenomenal results with her. I might have used her as a case study. She's one of my best case studies. I gave her phosphatidylcholine, and that stopped her seizures. Have I shared that case study with you, Denise? You'd probably remember if I did. She had obviously huge changes in the sense that her daughter moved in. She went from a tea and toast diet to her daughter cooking for her properly. She got her involved in dance classes. She was doing a lot more movement. We had her on lots of supplements. The seizures didn't stop, though, until the phosphatidylcholine. But before that, we were doing the vitamin D, and had her on calcium and all sorts of other things. But her bone density increased, and she was in her 70s. So her doctor couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it either. So as much as I'm sort of reeling off some of the things we're told, I always think back to that patient and go, you know what? We can make a difference at any age, particularly if you have a big change. But getting back to here, we want to be having enough protein, enough minerals, particularly our calcium, vitamin D as well, and exercise, which I've already started talking about, but getting into it now. So as I said, exercise has been found to serve as a means to sort of augment or mimic the effects of estrogen. And this is because it can boost the levels of certain hormones that are really important for maintaining muscle that naturally would decline. So when you're exercising, you're obviously stimulating all of these things. The other thing with exercise, if we are talking about bone density too, because some women will say to me, well, should I just, should I go on HRT? Do I need to have estrogen for bone density? The reality is, if you're not actually doing weight-bearing exercise and you're not getting in these minerals and calcium and vitamin D, you're not going to get the benefits anyway. By exercising, you're actually increasing blood flow to the muscles, to the bones. You're bringing in those nutrients to build those tissues. So if you're sort of sitting around and still living that comfortable life, but then going, well, I'm just going to have hormones, you're not going to get the benefits without doing these foundations either. There's no kind of easy ticket just here in the sense of, hey, I'm just going to jump to HRT. If you really want to be feeling truly better, strong, energetic, sleeping well, we want to be doing all these foundations. And as we know too, exercise can help decrease stress, so helping with that cortisol that I mentioned, bone health, and obviously also, maintaining our, blood glucose, helping with insulin regulation. You may find that particularly with age, some people can't do certain exercises or physical activity, but even walking has shown to be helpful. And then the other thing when we're thinking about cortisol, because as I said, we don't just want to think about our estrogen and progesterone, we also want to be thinking about balancing our cortisol and our insulin levels. And sometimes by doing that, that actually helps with a lot of the symptoms and even the metabolic things that go on, putting on weight during perimenopause. But meditation and massage have been shown to lower stress biomarkers. And I've got a particular study here showing reducing cortisol by, significant amounts. So these are other things, particularly, we want to try to do as many of these things as possible. But if someone comes in and they are limited because they're injured or they're in pain, letting them know there are other things they can do as well. And then hopefully the pain goes away, inflammation sorts, and as they start to feel better, they can do more exercise. So sleep tends to be the biggest complaint during perimenopause that I find. I have to say, even I'm struggling. I've always been I shouldn't say that. I think sometimes we say these things, and actually my Whoop band tells me that I sleep better than I think I do sometimes. I think it's great that we have all this knowledge, but sometimes we overthink things, as practitioners that, work in this space. And I do really focus on my sleep. And I do hear myself commonly saying things like, I'm a terrible sleeper, but the reality is sometimes my sleep is better than I think. But I have noticed that my sleep is, waking up at certain times. I've had a couple of hot flashes. They actually stopped during the BioAge study. One has come back since I've stopped. I'm going to get back onto that protocol. But definitely I have so many women that just can't sleep, that can't stay asleep. And it's really a big issue. And this obviously affects mood, memory, weight, and metabolic health. So things that need to be addressed are sleep hygiene, caffeine in the afternoon, alcohol. Of course, there's melatonin. It's often the go-to. And yes, it's really helpful. I was obviously having that when I was in the US, a different time zone. But getting back to these causes, and sometimes it's not just the stage of life. People are often on their phone in bed, or they are having a coffee late, Or, you know, they're drinking alcohol, and we know that alcohol actually increases the body temperature. You're already possibly going to be a little bit warmer due to what's going on with hormones. But when you want to get into that deep sleep, we actually need the body to cool down a little. We want some of these, you know, stress hormones to drop. When you drink alcohol, you're interrupting your sleep. So these are the kind of things that seriously need to be addressed. I love Dutch testing. I've already mentioned that, but it's good at looking at cortisol and melatonin as well, and understanding these sort of daily patterns, talking to people about their sleep, but also looking at other comorbid conditions. You know, do they have sleep apnea? Is there restless legs? Before talking about pain. Sometimes, you know, things like magnesium, I know it's simple, it's not always the answer, but sometimes just giving magnesium can be really helpful at night for sleeping, particularly if there is restless legs, or being on omega-3s for a while, you know, that anti-inflammatory effect, some mobility work, magnesium, and then helping get rid of this pain. Eating patterns, eating too much or, you know, too close to bedtime, and even exercise. Again, exercising late at night, it's going to increase your adrenaline, increase your cortisol, increase your body temperature. It can take hours for that core temperature to come down. So not exercising before bed. So when it comes to supplements, black cohosh is probably one of the most common supplements to think about during perimenopause and menopause. And this particular review, which was published only a few years ago, looked at 35 clinical trials and one meta-analysis with 43,000, almost 44,000 women. And of those, just over 13,000 treated with black cohosh. So it found that it actually was good at treating symptoms related to sleep, you know, insomnia and mood. And if you read through it, it actually says also too, you know, there is a good safety profile. This paper actually talks about in combination with St. John's wort. Now, I don't generally give St. John's wort. I'm not sure if any of you do, but it suggests the combination may actually have improved effects. But lots of research for black cohosh, and probably one of the most common things we give when we are thinking about night sweats and some of the symptoms linked with this transition from peri to menopause. The other one is chaste or vitex. Now, I actually give this a lot, not just for my women who are starting to, you know, notice these changes, having hormonal imbalance, but other women too, for fertility, or people that are just having even menopausal women that are just needing to balance their estrogen and progesterone. So this is definitely one of my favorites. I find that most people respond really, really well to it, and definitely something that I tend to give a lot. Now, if I'm thinking about giving it to a premenopausal woman because there are some imbalances in estrogen and progesterone, I tend to be looking at higher doses, but for menopause, particularly if it's in a blend, you can be looking at lower doses. And then the other one that I really love, and I personally really, really love this one, is motherwort. And we don't hear a lot about motherwort. So I actually didn't realize that motherwort had weak estrogen-like actions. I didn't realize that it was like a phytoestrogen. The reason I know motherwort is because I've had hyperthyroidism. I've had Graves. And with Graves, you get hot. You know, I've been hot. I run hot. You know, some people run cold, some people run hot. I run hot anyway. But obviously when I was hyperthyroid, I was really hot, you know, that sort of anxiety. I mean, I never really thought I was anxious, but definitely a million miles an hour, which again, I'm already like that. You could imagine me and then add in hyperthyroidism. But yeah, hot and, you know, palpitations. And this, honestly, motherwort, amazing. I cannot speak highly enough of this herb. I have lots of friends that are naturopaths. I'm not sure if any of you listening love this as well. I found this just through my own research, and it was a game changer because I got off medication. So I treated myself. didn't want to have my thyroid out. And the motherwort just was the icing on the cake kind of thing, in the sense it came on and I just was struggling to get off the medication. Every time I did, my thyroid play up again. I was on anti-thyroid medication. And this was really, really helpful. What I now realize is this has actually also been shown to be really beneficial in menopause, because obviously women get hot. They have their hot flashes. They do get a little bit anxious. They are dealing with a lot of the symptoms similar to feeling like you're a little bit hyperthyroid, like that nervousness and things like that. The only thing I would say, though, is that if someone is hypothyroid, and we do know that after menopause, a lot of women do become hypothyroid, not so much in the transition, but after pregnancy and after menopause, it is common for women to, or it's a time where they're more likely to become hypothyroid. But just watch out for that. If you are thinking about motherwort, think about their thyroid health, and if they're having really extremely heavy bleeding. Now, not just heavy bleeding, more so flooding. But that is a contraindication. But otherwise, I know firsthand how powerful this herb is, and very, very good if someone comes in and they're just telling you they're really struggling with the hot flashes. So this is the phyto balance that Pure Encapsulations have put together. I was not involved in the formulation. I was just really excited when I saw they had the motherwort, because you don't hear about it a lot. Obviously, black cohosh, the vitex, chaste tree are things that we often hear about. There's probably where the most evidence is, and sage too, thinking about hot flashes, licorice, which can be helpful with sort of cortisol and adrenal health as well. And obviously the polyphenols here. It's only a relatively lowish dose of motherwort, but a beautiful combination, and I find really does help women with hot flashes, and some of the symptoms around sleep. I'd have to say that even giving this, though, even though it can be really good for symptoms during perimenopause, I still have to do a lot for the sleep. It doesn't automatically fix the sleep, but definitely good for hot flashes, some of the mood stuff, which is really helpful. The other one is evening primrose oil. So evening primrose oil has got GLA, and this can potentially help hormone balance through prostaglandins. And there is mixed evidence. I mean, overall, there's mixed evidence for a lot of these things, but in general, when we look at big picture, it does seem that evening primrose does have some evidence. This is quite a good study. This is a single-blind randomized control trial. It did suggest that it didn't actually improve the hot flashes, but what it did do is stop the night sweats. So during the day, there may have been some hot flashes, but in this particular study, there was a significant improvement, a lower frequency and severity of night sweats. And this was taking 1,000 milligrams of evening primrose oil. And I have to say, this is one that a lot of women I work with say is a game changer as well. If you are doing testing looking at fatty acids, you can obviously look at not just your omega-3s and omega-6s. You can look for GLA and omega-6s and get a full breakdown. And interestingly, when I used to do a lot of it, I'm just getting back into doing these fatty acid tests after particularly seeing mine wasn't so good last year. I do find that a lot of perimenopausal women are low, and I don't know why. I don't know if anyone's got any insight there or potential mechanisms of why perimenopausal women would start to be lower in GLA. Not so much ALA or others, but particularly the GLA, I would see that. So aside from thinking about our hot flashes and our night sweats, and obviously we've got the phytobalance, the other thing that we really want to consider is metabolic health and weight management. I said before that sleep is the biggest complaint. I possibly was incorrect there. It's probably also weight. People come in and they're saying they're putting on weight. They're probably equally, I'm putting on weight, I can't sleep. And those things are obviously tied together as well. If someone can't sleep, they're more likely to put on weight. But berberine has so many properties in relation to not just inflammation, supporting lipids, metabolic syndrome, but I think weight too. Now, I did not have berberine in my healthy aging protocol. I had a nicotinamide riboside, so the mitochondrial ATP, pure encapsulations mitochondrial ATP. I had resveratrol, but I didn't have berberine. And I think of berberine often too as, using this for people that have gut issues. We know that it's a bit of an antimicrobial as well. And I knew that it could help with lipids, but I didn't realize how good it was in this sort of weight management. In the last year, I've had a lot of patients tell me, of course, with diet and exercise as well, but the berberine I think has been really helpful for helping them lose weight, particularly if they're a bit of a plateau. So this is the metabolic extra. It's obviously got chromium that can help with blood sugar regulation, possibly even sugar cravings, the berberine, alpha lipoic acid, and a small amount of resveratrol. But berberine is probably one of my new favorite supplements. And if I could put the healthy aging protocol together, I would definitely add berberine to that. And something that we can give to women, particularly when they are starting to find it a little bit harder to shift that weight. I mean, there's some, I don't think it's obviously nearly as powerful, but some people saying that, berberine, similar mechanisms to things like metformin and some of these other now Ozempics and things like that, that come with so many side effects that we want to avoid. And then the other one, I mean, I've got this in metabolic health. This could really sit anywhere, but magnesium, I think it's probably one of my favorites for many of my patients, not just in perimenopause, but we do have evidence that it can help with dysmenorrhea, PMT, menstrual migraines. And I have just noticed, even myself, as I said, my cycles have changed. I was someone that was very regular, had a relatively light menstrual cycle, whereas now it is getting a little bit heavier, it's getting shorter, and I was starting to get pain so much that I would wake up at night and think, wow, I know I'm about to, get my menstrual cycle. And that has never happened in my, however many years, 30 years of, getting my menstrual cycle. But magnesium citrate, even though magnesium glycinate can be quite good for calming and sleep, but magnesium citrate. And I don't know if you have access to them. Do you have the magnesium gummies over there, Denise? Do you have those? Where are they? Do you...
magnesium gummies, but we have the magnesium glycinate. That's one of our popular ones.
So I think magnesium glycinate is a really nice formulation if we're thinking about stress and sleep, and particularly for this population, perimenopause. But when I was at IFM, I went over to the stand because I needed to get my bowels moving, because after traveling from one side of the world to the other, I was feeling a bit blocked. And I said to them, now this might be too much information. I said, but I need some magnesium to get things moving. And they gave me these gummies. And I don't think we can access them here in Australia, but they are delicious. And they've just got a few like prebiotics, fructooligosaccharides and stuff. But anyway, they're really good. So if you do end up getting these gummies, I highly recommend them. And what was interesting is I've kind of been having them since, getting back from the US and last week. And just noticed how much better everything has been. So yeah, magnesium. And what I probably realized is I need a higher dose. I've been having about 600 milligrams with these gummies, whereas when I'm having the glycinated citrate, I was just having 150 milligrams. And I think it's just not enough if we're thinking about the sleep and some of these, premenstrual symptoms and that come along, even when you've had a lovely cycle most of your life. So the other thing with magnesium is not only is it helpful for relaxation, sleep, some of these symptoms, even menstrual migraines, the magnesium and calcium obviously for bone health as well, which is something we definitely want to be addressing during this perimenopausal stage, so that when women become menopausal, they don't have osteopenia or osteoporosis. So when it comes to my approach, I start with diet and lifestyle. So doing my 4-week whole food challenge, and obviously it doesn't end at 4 weeks, but that is a real kickstart where there is a big focus on diet. They're recording their food. As I said, we really focus on teaching everyone about, sugars, added sugars, refined carbohydrates, taking out gluten and dairy, then putting them back in and working out whether these are good foods for them, and then getting a plan going depending on where they're at with exercise. Now, sometimes, as I said, with this patient who took out the dairy and lost 6 kilos and is feeling great, this might be enough. But in most cases, we do want to add in some additional support. So looking at the hormonal support, so looking at things that can help them with the night sweats and the hot flashes, and then if they're needing that support around weight loss, that metabolic extra that I was talking about. And for most people, even if they're not struggling with weight, perhaps it's just, the sleep, adding in things like magnesium. Now, what I haven't mentioned that most of my patients get to is omega-3s, and a lot do get B vitamins as well. But if we're focusing on the hormones, we really do want to be thinking about those herbs that I said in the black cohosh, the vitex. And for most of the women, if they're not hypothyroid, or having, if they haven't got endometriosis or having, really heavy bleeding, then thinking about that motherwort as well. And then if this doesn't work, I'm not anti-HRT. I'm not anti that. And I think that particularly being at IFM, it's obviously really common in the US. Almost everyone is on HRT. I'm not sure how common it is in Asia. Not as common here. Becoming very popular. HRT is becoming very popular here. I think for a long time, that study, the Nurses' Health study that we all know about, when it suggested that HRT increased risk of breast cancer, kind of shocked everyone. And for a long time there, it was thought, HRT really isn't safe and does increase risk of breast cancer and really should only be, given in under certain conditions. But what we now know when we go back and look at that data is that those women were over 65. This wasn't in those perimenopausal women, and it was synthetic hormones. So it does seem that bioidentical hormones given in this transition period may be beneficial and not linked with increased risk. But what I would suggest, and definitely the way that I do things, is starting with the diet and lifestyle and the supplements, because sometimes that is enough. Now, I haven't seen this published, but it was mentioned at IFM, and I've heard this many times before. Some of the top experts, I believe, possibly even Felice Gersh and Sarah Godfred, to talk about the percentages of women that go through menopause or perimenopause and have severe symptoms. So it's suggested that about 25% of women will almost breeze through menopause. Like they might have some symptoms, but it doesn't knock them about too much. Whereas about 25% can have severe symptoms. And then there's that 50% in the middle that sort of, are a little bit up and down. So I think we want to be cautious with HRT too, because there will be some women that actually don't have significant symptoms. And I meet some of these women too. They might come to me for something else and they'll say, oh, yeah, I've been through menopause. The doctor told me my period stopped. And you just think, wow, considering that I speak to some women that struggle so much. So we always want to start with the diet and the lifestyle, giving some of these supplements that have very good evidence for helping balance our hormones. But if that is not working and symptoms are still severe and it's impacting someone's quality of life, then definitely thinking about hormones, working with a practitioner who can ideally get those, compounded or exactly what they need. So in summary, a whole food diet with plenty of protein, thinking about the meal timing and avoiding or limiting alcohol. Now, some people don't like hearing that, but really, if you want to transition through menopause or perimenopause and you want to sleep well, getting rid of alcohol. I like a drink, but I basically stopped drinking last year. And I know that it was affecting, me. And I think that my symptoms would be much worse if I was still drinking alcohol. Focus on strength training, sleep hygiene, and this parasympathetic activation. So massage, meditation, key supplements that have good evidence shown to support hormones, shown to reduce symptoms, known to be associated with perimenopause and metabolic changes. And if someone needs it, definitely HRT, but really emphasizing that not all women do need that.